Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first all-black military pilot group who fought in World War II. The pilots formed the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces. They were active from 1941 to 1946, and there were 932 pilots who graduated from the program. Among these, 355 served in active duty during World War II as fighter pilots. In this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with one of those pilots, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart Jr., one of the last surviving Tuskegee Airmen of World War II. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart's story as a pilot goes back to when he was a boy and was in love with aviation, but it really kicks off when he journeyed in a segregated rail car to Army basic training in Mississippi in 1943. He left his mostly integrated home in New York down to the South, where he heard comments like colored people aren't accepted as airline pilots, or the thought was that black pilots didn't have the proper reflexes to make a first-class fighter pilot. But 2 years later, Stewart was at the controls of a P-51 looking to shoot Luftwaffe aircraft out of the sky 5,000 feet over the Austrian countryside. He took out German fighters over the course of 43 missions, and he and his group is credited with making enormous progress in the U.S. military, ultimately leading to the desegregation of forces in 1948. He personally was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. And there were all sorts of challenges they faced during the war. Unlike white pilots, Stewart and other Tuskegee flyers faced the extra danger that if they were shot down over enemy territory, they couldn't hide in plain sight with the population or expect to live. One of Stewart's friends was shot down, captured, and lynched by a racist mob. But in addition to making history in many ways, Stewart and his fighter group defied expectations and won the first post-war Air Force-wide gunnery competition for propeller-driven fighters. He also obtained honorary captain status from American and Delta Airlines after being denied piloting jobs with these airlines 50 years ago because of his ethnicity. So anyway, we get a lot into military history, the history of America in the 20th century, and all sorts of other things. So I hope you enjoy this discussion with Lieutenant Colonel Harry Stewart. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I can't wait to get into your story, and I figure let's just go right back to the beginning and go from there. How long have you had a love of flying? Was it shortly before World War II began, or has that always been a part of your life?
It's always been part of my life. I think it started maybe around infancy, maybe around a year and a half or 2 years old. I was born in Newport News, Virginia, not far from Langley Field, Virginia, which was the Air Force's or United States Army Air Corps' preeminent air base at the time. And I think that, the aircraft soaring over the house all the time and my looking up from my crib there at the aircraft, I think there was some sort of a responsive chord there that beckoned me to look into the field of flying later on,
I've had the honor of talking to other World War II vets, and many of them say after Pearl Harbor, many were motivated to enlist. But before World War II, what was the idea of being a pilot? Did many people have this a dream, or was this something that was more of a niche thing or for a smaller crowd? Did a lot of people have dreams like yours?
No, I think I'm going back to the 30s now, and I think that this was a very popular thing, aviation at the time, with the youngsters, with the impressionable youngsters on the block where I lived anyway. I lived not too far, I guess, in walking distance from what is now LaGuardia Airport. And what we used to do as kids in the neighborhood there, we used to build these model airplanes. They were made out of balsa wood, tissue paper, and a rubber band that would go ahead and turn the propeller on the planes. And we used to talk about the different aircraft that were flying at the time, the Martin 10, B-10 bomber and that type of thing. So there was just an interest with us kids, and I think there were a number of movies that came out at the time also that featured the glamour of flying, James Cagney and James Dunn and actors like that in pictures like Dawn Horizon and Flying. And I think they all made enough of an impression upon us kids there that when World War II started growing, we found an interest in possibly going into the service and becoming military pilots, which I did, of course. I did take the examination when I became eligible and did go into the service as a aviation cadet.
Can you think of any specific instances in your childhood or as a young adult that made you so motivated to want to be a military aviator? Were you happy to serve in any part of the military, or were you specifically thinking about being a pilot? And was there anything from your childhood that you think motivated you to want to serve?
Specifically as a pilot there. And of course, all of the youngsters at that time, we ran around the street and we were either playing cowboys or Indians and then playing soldier or something like that. But I was always motivated as far as the flying was concerned. And I really did not consider going into any other branch of the service at the time. But then, of course, I had to look at the fallback position there. And I felt as though, I don't know why, but if I couldn't make it as a pilot, I would go into the tank corps and learn how to drive a tank. I don't know why, but the principal motivation was that of being a pilot, and I never gave up the idea of being a pilot.
Well, I'd love to hear about when you began flight school. And to give some listeners context who don't know as much about the Tuskegee Airmen, did you know of them when you were enlisting in the service, or were you enlisting and hoping for the best? What was it like when you enlisted in the military?
I had found out about the Tuskegee. Well, let me correct the term Tuskegee Airmen.
Yes.
That term was a term that was adopted by a writer by the name of Charles Francis. He wrote a book in 1972, and it was about the African-American pilots during World War II. And for want of a name, he named the book the Tuskegee Airmen because all of these pilots trained down at Tuskegee. So it was a generic term. It was no specific term as far as the military was concerned. The organization that I flew with was the 332nd Fighter Group at the time, and it had these military designations. But I was in junior high school, I guess, at the time, and I was at a library period, and I picked up a popular science magazine, I believe it was, and in a little blurb in the magazine there, it mentioned that the Air Corps was going to form a squadron of African-American or black aviators, and they were going to name it the 99th Pursuit Squadron. And at that time, I said, that's for me, that's where I'm going to go, because I did recognize at that time that prior to that the Air Corps did not accept blacks for training as pilots in the Army Air Corps. So I said, that's where I want to go. If there's an opportunity there, I want to take it. And I dreamed of going with the 99th, and sure enough, those dreams came true later in life.
Can you walk me through the process of enlistment and then training? This is well before the time of flight simulators or things like that. What was it like to train?
It was the flight training school at the time, and I would eventually be assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group.
Okay.
But the training was actually the standard, absolute standard Air Corps training that they were giving throughout the Air Corps at the time. It was 4 phases involved in the training. The first was pre-flight. And in pre-flight, I was taught things like navigation, engine mechanics, principles of flight, those type of things, but I was not doing any flying itself. The first phase of flying By the way, each one of these phases was about 2.5 months. The first phase of flying was called primary. And at that time was when I began flying, and the standard aircraft throughout the Air Corps at the time was a Boeing PT-17, they call it. It was a bi-wing aircraft, and with two cockpits in it, one for the instructor and one for the student. And that was the first craft that I soloed in. I soloed after about 7 hours, I guess. And then my total training came to about 60 hours of flight training in primary. The next, if you complete primary, the next phase of the training was called basic. And there you move to a more advanced aircraft. It was a 450 horsepower, all metal aircraft that had a enclosed canopy on it. And there again, I got about 60 hours in that craft. And if I was successful, or any cadet that's successful in passing through the basic, the last phase of the flying, it's called advanced. And there I flew an even more advanced aircraft called the North American AT-6. And that was a retractable landing gear. It was very much like a fighter plane, 650 horsepower, Pratt and Whitney engine, and just about had all of the basic refinements of fighter craft. Again, I got 60 hours in that craft there. When I graduated from there, I was given my wings. I was 19 years old at the time, and my commission of second lieutenant as 19 years old. And I went from there to fighter transition. I went to what's called a P-40 Warhawk, which was the plane you might recognize. You see the tiger shark face on it, or the tiger shark teeth. That a lot of those planes were flown over in China at the time. But I had a number of hours in that craft, training in that craft. And then I was sent to Walterboro, South Carolina. By the way, the previous training, all of it was done at Tuskegee. After this training, I was sent to Walterboro, South Carolina, where I received 80 hours of flight time in the P-47 Thunderbolt, P-47, and I flew the models B, C, and D Thunderbolt. And from there, I went overseas, and when I got overseas to Italy at the base that I would be stationed at in Ramatelli, Italy, I checked out in the T-51 Mustang. And of course, that was the sort of the Cadillac of the fighter pilot division at the time here.
And before we get too far into your story, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, could you tell me about the process of enlisting, being a military aviator as an African American before the armed forces are desegregated? I think it's 48, if I remember correctly. For you and the other Black servicemen, was there a sense that you were sort of at the elite level since there were so few opportunities for you to be able to serve in these types of combat roles?
Oh, absolutely, because most of the roles for the African-American soldier going into the service in those days during World War II was some type of job servitude, and very few opportunities for any type of elite job, especially that of being an aviator and, as I said, a pilot. Going into the service, I was raised in a very integrated section in New York City and had not really witnessed much of the segregation that you'd find throughout other parts of the country. The enlistment was the same as the standard enlistment. I went in with the kids from my neighborhood to take the examination, and as I said, the neighborhood was mostly integrated. Irish and some